Greetings, everyone, and welcome to yet another new segment of the Board Game Buffet podcast. Although this one will not be in audio form, it'll just be in video form, at least for now, I think. And this is one that I don't think we officially have a title for it yet, but it is going to be about wargaming. And it's going to be about wargaming from the point of view, or primarily the point of view, of someone new to the wargaming hobby. So you're gonna hear Graeme talk quite a bit throughout this video series, and kind of what we wanted to do with this video series was, I mean, at heart, I guess I would consider myself a wargamer first and foremost. I kind of dip in and dip out of it depending on my interests, and I have over the years I've talked to Graeme about the joys of wargaming and what he's missing, and he has dabbled in it, but it's not something that he considers himself to be. I don't believe he considers himself to be a wargamer. I don't know if that's because he doesn't feel like he's played enough games, or because he thinks there's a negative connotation to that term. I think sometimes he maybe a lot of people, and that's kind of one of the reasons of this video, people have some nerves or just some trepidation about getting into a new aspect of the hobby, because maybe they're so far behind the eight ball. So many other people have been in the hobby for such a long time, they don't want to seem like they're a total noob, or whatever the case may be. So this video series is going to kind of look at what he likes, or what he thinks he likes, what may be enticing to him to the hobby, and then hopefully on my end giving him some suggestions and getting him to play some of these games and explore a little further about, okay, I like this, I didn't like that, let's try this style of game, let's try that style of game, and kind of see how it develops. And maybe after a year, maybe he'll stick to his guns, and I'm not a war gamer. I'd rather do whatever. And I'm not saying, if you become a war gamer, you can't play hobby games, because I enjoy hobby, the mainstream hobby games, Euro games. But I think there is, if nothing else, for me anyways, this pandemic has shown that there are a lot of things that you can try that maybe you didn't have to try, because you were always getting together face to face with people. And war games for me, not only because there are a lot that are solo, but there are also a lot that are technically just 2-player games, but they can be played solo. Whether you don't have to necessarily use a bot. There's some games with bots, but you can easily play a war game solo that's designed for 2 people. It's just a matter of playing both sides. And so maybe some people are like, well, I don't know how you could do that, but trust me, in the wargaming hobby, I don't know what the percentages would be, but I would venture to guess that at least 50% of the war games being played are being played solo, even though they're not technically solo games, because there are just a lot of people that enjoy it that way. And there are a lot of people that don't have anyone else that's interested in playing it. So am I being a little selfish and trying to convert Graeme into a war gamer? I don't know. I'm very altruistic.
You always are.
Yeah. So are you excited about this, Graeme? Are you begrudgingly just like, whatever, let's do this?
No, it's funny because I've done my entire board gaming career, for the last 10 years as a Euro gamer. And that kind of, that's because that's what I got into first, and that's what I enjoy. So I'm always looking for the new Euro game. It kind of then excludes other styles of games, like trick-taking games. There's a large number of people that love them. I enjoy trick-taking games, but they're not my primary go-to type style of game. And then when I look at war games, that was another kind of offshoot that I wasn't exposed to. But unlike trick-taking games, when the rule book looked to be about 2 pages long, when I looked at a war game, it was, I don't even know where to start for this. And I'm not a great historian when it comes to the different wars that have happened. So like there's no theme pulling me into it. And then it was like, okay, well, they're talking about all these battles that I don't know, that looks like it's going to take, hours. And a lot of them look like they're either 1 or 2 player games. And when I got into gaming, it was for, for the group of us to play. We had to start up a gaming group, and we played a lot of games. And I felt like those war games were going to be exclusionary because they were 1 or 2 player games. I'm sure there's 4 player games, but I was really focusing on getting games that were good for 3 or 4 players. Then if I was looking for a 2 player game, I'd be playing those games with my wife. I wasn't sure whether Lella would want to play a war game, just because, again, there was the connotation. And with having almost no exposure to war games, you look at them as those things over there, which are complex, chit pushers, will take hours. You have to go through 50-page rule books just to get it to the table. And was like, do I really want to go through that effort for a game I may or may not like, that I'm not vested into the theme? And that's why I've always kind of seen war games as those things over there that other people play. Mm-hmm. That is going to take a lot of upfront investment to get over the hurdle to learn how to play them, when I'm happy in kind of my own sandbox of what I'm playing with now.
Yeah, and I think that's can be true for war games. I think it can be true for, a lot of things. I know within the board gaming hobby, we definitely tend to see little micro groups, or I would say cliques, because that sounds bad, but there are people that want to play the heavy Euro games, whether it's an 18xx or whatever, and they or people that play that only play splatter games. They're I think we always have a tendency to want to put ourselves in some sort of pecking order. And our group, the group you're in, you always want it to be on top. And so sometimes crossing those lines is scary. I can imagine going to, if you're going to a big meetup somewhere and you never played an 18xx game, to want to jump into an 18xx game with people that have played it forever. I'm sure they'd be welcoming. I would assume not everybody is welcoming, but they'd probably be happy to show that game, that system that they love so much, to a new person and get them involved. And I think wargaming is the same. I don't consider myself a grognard by any means. And I know, within wargaming groups, people like to talk about, oh, he's a grog, or they like to think of themselves as a grognard. And I think outside of the wargaming, like within the Euro game hobby, people get intimidated by that. Maybe they don't know what it means, but it's like, well, so I am immediately going to be looked down upon if I'm not a grog. So putting all that aside, I think this is hopefully going to be a good way of, immersing yourself a little bit into the hobby and seeing what you like or what you don't like. And, if you decide to stick with it, or, find those types of games within the hobby that you like, then that's great. And if you don't, well, then that's fine too.
But I think it's also going to hopefully be beneficial, that I think for our listeners and viewers, the people that, listen to our podcast, whatever else, a lot of them are Euro gamers that don't have experience with wargaming are probably pretty close to my situation. They know Euro games, and war games are those things over there that they're not going to touch. So hopefully through this, the series of videos, they can kind of learn through me that I am in the same situation you are. And this is kind of where it branched off, and hopefully get more people to try different styles of games.
Yeah. And I think also to kind of finish that out is the notion that, what was I going to say on that? I had a perfect thought when you were speaking, and then so if people are watching, it's one of those where you can maybe kind of play along sort of thing. Because this first episode, I sent you a questionnaire asking you a bunch of questions of what you think not what you think, what you like, what you don't like, what's more interesting to you. And I don't think you need to be a history major or be a history buff or be someone who is overly into war itself to enjoy a war game. It may make it more enjoyable, but I think for someone coming like from the Euro game perspective, or someone especially like a splatter, these games are it's the strategy, and that's what makes you want to play those Euro games. It's the strategy. It's the I wouldn't say it's the puzzle for a war game, but it's the seeing how things connect. Oh, if I do this with this type of troop on this type of terrain, oh, that's much better than, this or that. And I've always said this, and I don't know if anyone ever agrees with me, but I think it's much easier for a person that maybe is a splatter player where components aren't necessarily that important to make that transition to a war game because they're used to, cardboard, and they're used to, they don't need to have big flashy miniatures, or they don't need to have big overproduced style of games to enjoy it. Because a lot of war games are, I'm not saying they're poor quality, they're not overly produced. It might be a paper mat that you're going to play on. It's a lot of chits. So maybe it's wooden blocks. So I think it's almost easier for them to transition from a heavy Euro gamer to a war gamer than, let's say, a war gamer who someone's going to try to entice them and say, okay, well, hey, let's play these Ameritrash games. Let's play these dudes on a map style of game. And I can tell you from my perspective, I that's not the type. I mean, when I look at that, I mean, that's not the type of game that I enjoy. I love, wargaming, historical miniatures, and I love, historical board war games. But Ameritrash style games, I have very little interest in. I don't have very much interest in the whole dudes on a map sort of thing. So, and I don't know why, but I think it's just because it's going to get me in trouble, but I think you lose the sophistication of going from a strategy game to an Ameritrash game. That's going to sound really bad. And I'm not sure that's a perfect way to say it, but it's said, so whatever.
But I understand that you come from, and that's one of the reasons why, as much as I love Euro games, I realize that not everybody wants to sit down and burn their brain for an hour, 2, 3 hours, however long it takes. And the Ameritrash is more of a boisterous, fun experience around the table that relies less on long-term strategies and more of randomness and just telling a story, like telling a good story that the game brings out.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm not as big fan of them either, because for me, the enjoyment comes from the game and the strategy that I'm building up through the game. I'm not looking to tell a story. I'm not looking to, when the game finishes, going, oh, you remember that die roll? And, we needed all 6s and you rolled 5 out of 6 and then you bumped the table and the last one moved to a 6 and wasn't that great. I'm more of the person that would be on the Eurogame side saying, remember that strategy I started on turn 2 and finally played off, an hour later? That's where I get the benefit. That's where I get my enjoyment from.
Right. Yeah. So I think of it as, if I'm looking at it from a miniature style kind of analogy, to me, you have miniature games which are epic, where they've got thousands of miniatures out on the table, and at the end of 4 hours, maybe you've moved 12 inches. But your battle lines are formed, and you whatever. And then you've got the beer and pretzel style miniature games, where it's just a dice chucker. You're looking for that epic sort of moment of, my guy's standing on the wall, and he's there by himself, and he's just firing off his pistols or whatever. To me, that's kind of the difference between a nice strategy war game versus an Ameritrash game. I mean, they're Ameritrash can be fun, but they're much more of a beer and pretzels dice chucking game, which I love. I mean, look at Eldritch Horror. Eldritch Horror is a dice chucking game. Love it. But
you had to get Eldritch Horror in this.
I do. Now, if I can just find a way to squeeze an Arkham Horror LCG. So, all right. Do you remember, what was the first war game that you played?
So this is interesting because when Dean and I were talking, I had a very narrow idea of what a war game was. So Dean went through my list on Board Game Geek and sent me a list of all the war games as classified by Board Game Geek. And I kind of went, really? That's considered a war game? If we go by I'm going to have to go by what Board Game Geek says, because I don't have the depth of knowledge to know what a war game is and isn't. I'm just going to look at what it's classified on there. I think my first one I played was probably Twilight Struggle. I wouldn't, before we got into the discussion, I would not consider Twilight Struggle what I would think of as a war game. Like, I understand that it is about the Cold War, but I don't think of it as a separate classification like I do for other war games. So yeah, Twilight Struggle was my first war game. My first, what I would consider close to being what I think of a war game would be Commands and Colors Ancients, which it is, your battle lines on the map that you're moving and attacking other players. That's what I associate more with it as a war game.
Well, and I think, well, we might as well just talk about it now. So I think within the wargaming hobby, there's always that argument of what's a war game, what isn't a war game. And I think, like yourself, there is a good chunk of people within the wargaming hobby that does not feel that Twilight Struggle is truly a war game, even though it's the #1 ranked war game on BGG. And we can argue it all day long, but for our circumstances, we're gonna stick with what BGG classifies the games. So they do consider it to be a war game, and to me, it's a great game. When you played it, even though you didn't think it was a war game, what was it? And I know you love card-driven games. Was that the thing that really kind of made you enjoy the game the most, or was it more thematic?
I am kind of split over Twilight Struggle. I enjoy it at a mechanism level. That whole, when you're playing a card, are you playing it for the points, or are you playing it for the event? And if you play it for the points and it's the other person's event, so you're kind of looking at all the cards trying to decide what you want to do. I don't know very much about the Cold War and about the time period that Twilight Struggle took place. So although a lot of the cards are very thematic, and I know they're thematic, I don't know the history behind them. So there was kind of a disconnect, and I've only played it a couple times. And without knowing all the cards in the game, it feels, and this is one of the things that always kept me from playing other war games, was I felt like I was missing about 3/4 of the game because I didn't understand the history and the entire deck makeup of cards and how everything's going to be interacting. I approached it more like a Euro game, in which it was very tactical. I look at the cards in my hand and play the one I think is best. Not, I understand the overall, I understand what the arc of the game is going to go through. So I'm going to hold on to this card because I know in half an hour's time it's going to become more valuable than it is now. I was just playing the cards as I got them in my hand. So I recognized that it was a good game, but I also recognized that I was probably not getting the full game that other people who love it were getting out of the game.
Okay. So then, going to Commands and Colors Ancients, I think that's a time period that you probably enjoy a little more. Again, it's a hand management style of game, but you are moving blocks out on the table. What was it? Was it more the theme for that one that drew you in, or again, was it the card play?
I think it was the idea of, I don't know whether it's classified as a block war game or not, but the idea of, I'd heard about people talking about block war games. And I think we might talk about another one, which I think is more aligned to a block war game later. But Commands and Colors was the idea of, it sounded approachable, that I didn't have to read a 50-page rule book to play a war game. And yes, so the time period is, historical wise, it's my favorite time period to learn about. And it sounded like it was an approachable game. And it also sounded as if it was a game that was going to be easily teachable, because you just have a hand of cards. You activate, left or center, right, line, whatever, and you just did it. There was dice rolling, but it was quick turns. Play a card, move your troops, attack. Next person, they play a card, move your troops, and attack. And I realized, because it was, the barrier of entry I felt for that one is so low, you got into playing the game fairly quickly. And I never felt, after the first couple turns, once you kind of learn how the battles work and the retreating and all that, I didn't feel like I was missing half the game. I felt like I was getting a full game experience with putting half an hour into learning it, for example. I didn't feel like One that's not on the list, which I have broached before, is ASL starter kit. So the Advanced Squad Leader in starter kit 1. I felt, even after reading the rule book for an hour, I didn't feel I was any further forward to understanding how to play. In an hour of Commands and Colors, I was halfway through my first game going, I understand how this game works.
Right.
So it was an approachable, I felt like an entry into, dipping a toe into the world of confrontational war games.
Yeah. So from a rule book viewpoint, it's definitely not intimidating, like Commands and Colors versus, say, an ASL. Do you think and I know, I mean, you can read heavy rule books, you play a lot of heavy games. I know that's not a factor, but do you find that if you had a 20-page Splatter rule book and a 20-page war game rule book, do you think there's an intimidation factor just because it's a war game? Or I mean, I think war game rule books, I mean, you know me, I'm a GMT fanboy, and their rule books can look intimidating, but I think for the most part, the layout of most war game rule books are very well done, especially if they give you an index, but just kind of how everything is laid out. And I know when people flipped through, they were like, oh, my rule 7.12 or A or whatever. So there is that intimidation that can be there. But once you kind of start going through it, it makes sense. And there's a lot of repetition in those rule books. Do you think that that was a barrier of entry for you?
So what I think is the barrier of entry, and it's funny, we just talked about, we just recorded something else. I was talking about this game here, Horizon Zero Dawn. This is a 50-page rule book, but I can internalize that. And what I found when I was trying to dip my toes further into the wargaming, it wasn't so much the size of the rule book. So a 20-page rule book on Eurogame or a war game doesn't intimidate me. I find internalizing the rule set for Eurogame easier to do because there are less. I don't need to know how this gun works. How do I reload my gun? How many dice am I rolling for if it hits? And then if I decide to change, put a different scope on it, to put a different magazine, how many bullets am I firing? I felt like when I was looking at the war games, it was, I'm not interested in the real life counterparts that they're trying to replicate in the war. I don't care about guns. I don't care about tanks. I don't care about planes. I don't care about those type of things. Like, guns just do not fundamentally interest me. So when you tell me this is a whatever versus a whatever, I'm like, okay, so I have no concept what that means, which is why I think for Commands and Colors, because I knew how they fought and I knew the time period more than a lot of the more modern stuff, it was easier to internalize over. I understand the difference between a spear and an arrow. I understand the difference between a foot soldier and a cavalry person. When I was looking at more of the more modern day wargaming, it was, I don't want to have to internalize all the different types of tanks and all the different types of terrains and all the different types of guns and whatever else. I just want to know how to play the game. And I felt like I was saying before about missing half the game. It's because I'm missing that piece of what I felt the war game was. That I understood how to move my people, but then it was like, okay, well, if you move this person through wet terrain and they're wearing, combat boots, they're going to have this. If they're walking through desert and they're carrying a backpack, it's going to be this, and they're unencumbered or encumbered, and that whole type of thing. It was just everything I wanted to do in a war game felt like, hold on for a second, flip, flip, flip. Okay, yes, I add 1 to my movement. Flip, flip, flip. Oh, now I lose 2 because of this. Flip. Oh, it's raining, so it's here, and flip. Okay, now I'm gonna move my chit. Dink. It felt like an awful lot of work to do anything.
Right.
And again, I'm sure there's people that are war gamers already yelling at me right now, but this is from an outsider's point of view. This is the way I viewed it.
Well, and that's fine, because within wargaming and like the questionnaire I sent you, there are different types of war games. You can have a tactical war game, which is, small unit skirmish. It could be man to man even style, where that type of thing is important. What type of gun do I have? What's its range? Versus, it sounds like you're going to be more of an operational or strategic type of game war gamer, where you don't need to get down in the weeds with tanks. tank's a tank, or because you're dealing at bigger units. So we're not worried about this gun. This is an 88 millimeter, you know, turret gun, whatever the case may be. Um, so that's fine, because there's so many different choices within wargaming. Do you so like the first war game I remember playing was probably back in mid 80s, early 80s. And it was when I was in high school, and there was a game. It was Columbia Games, which I know Columbia Games because you own at least one or two of them. And it was a block war game, and it was the War of 1812 or 1812. I can't remember the exact title. And I remember playing this in one of my classes. It was a military history class, and I was just like, I was blown away. It was the the blocks where they're step downs, basically what we call them, step down units. So as you take casualties, you kind of rotate the blocks, and I could visually see that. And there was that fog of war of, I can see my stuff, I can't see my opponent's stuff, and vice versa. So let's do a little bit of bluffing, and let's retreat these units and kind of mix them together, then separate them out, and that whole feint. And I just was like, man, I just love it. And that's what kind of, for me, flipped the switch. I mean, I'd always been a history buff. I'd always been a military, war movies, John Wayne movies, that type of stuff I always loved. And, especially like the old black and white movies where they're in the war room, and they're using their little pushing sticks, and they're moving the blocks around the table. So that's kind of what it felt like to me. I'm like, oh, this is so cool. And there it just kind of snowballed. I got heavily into historical miniature gaming because we had a club at school. And then I remember my mom bought me my first Avalon Hill game, which was Bull Run, about the Civil War battle. And man, I just loved it. Over time, I kind of got out of the board war gaming side of it and got heavily into the miniature side. And like I said, I kind of ebb and flow. I dip my toe in here, I bounce in, I bounce out. I'll play a bunch, and then maybe I'll get tired. I'll go, go do, whatever for some time. But at heart, I always seem to get drawn back into it. And I think it's just I think it's, for me, it's a lot of it is thematic. It's the history in it, but it's also, more than anything else, I think it's the strategy. And we've talked about this on the podcast numerous times, where I can get just as much joy of setting up the game and getting all the units out on the board and just kind of staring at it, and playing a two-player war game solo. I make my moves on this side, and then maybe I'll come back the next day and I'll make my moves on that side, but looking at it from both sides. And for me, that's I maybe I'm just weird, but I just really enjoy that part of the hobby. So as far as the questionnaire, so I sent Graeme this questionnaire, and I gave him a bunch of different categories, and it was just kind of to ask him to kind of rank what he thought, or was of his highest interest level to him. So I asked you types of war games. I gave you tactical, operational, strategic, and then what many would consider to be monster war games. And you said what you believe would be your number one choice would be operational. So kind of the according to BGG, we'll go with their definition. So that's an entire small war or a campaign within a much larger war, theater of operation, so on and so forth. Could have political production, could have unit production, but not necessarily the entire war, unless it's a small one, but more of focusing in on different campaigns within it. So you put that as your number one. So what is it about that is what draws you into that type of, or what you think is going to be that type of game?
So for me, the reason why I picked that was my number one is because when I was reading the description, it sounded like what Commands and Colors was. Commands and Colors will tend to give you an entire battle, and then you can play them together to create the war. Also, I've played mini games before, like Warhammer. I've played too many mini games, but the idea that you are starting and ending something, as opposed to saying out of this entire 10-year period, you're going to focus on this 2-week period in the middle. I thought that something that was higher level, that I didn't have to deal with the individual units and what they're walking through and whatever else. Not that I dislike that, but it's like I'm moving this battalion, fleet, whatever, this
Whatever.
this group. I'm going to move this group from here to here. And yes, it's got may has to go through different terrain. So I can, I have 5 movement points. I can spend 4 to move them because I have to go over a hill or something like that. That it was at a higher level that I could still move people around in an area, but it wasn't at the really low level. And it also wasn't at the monster. This is going to take all week to play this, because we're gonna recreate everything. That to me, when I was reading the description, felt like it was a good level that I'd be interested in. That you have some conclusion to what happens, but it wasn't going to be overly long, and it wasn't going to be too fine a detail where I was going to, if I didn't know the exact time period, I felt like if I was going to go down to like the skirmish level, that I would need to know more about the specifics of the actual units. Like this type of unit. They have a mix of this gun and this gun. So, how many of this group of people do you want to have this one? And how many grenades are they going to carry? And how much, how far they're going to be able to walk? I wanted to go the next level up and say, I'm just going to move this unit. And there's a mix of people in there. I don't care about the mix. Just, what do I have to roll? What do I have to get? What card do I have to play or whatever to have them activate, that type of thing.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just kind of jotting down some notes as well, because I know you filled out the questionnaire, but sometimes hearing you extrapolate on it kind of gives me a little finer, fine tune it a little bit.
Yeah. And I'm reading this sometimes not really knowing what it means for a war game. So I kind of looked at your descriptions and kind of said, yeah, that's what I think I like.
Yeah. I mean, operational, strategic, it's a fine, to me, it's a fine line. I mean, there are some that they're going to be the same style of game. It's just what they're covering is going to be slightly different. Tactical, I think I gave you the example, to me, a tactical game is Combat Commander. Yes. I mean, even though you can play that, I guess, technically in a campaign and chain them together, it is small units, squad level, platoon level, very few chits out on the board, but you're moving on that hex, and it does matter. Okay, I'm moving through this type of terrain. It's wooded or it's marshy, that sort of thing. And while they don't get into the nuances of like how many grenades I'm carrying and stuff like that, you do have those extra chits of, I have a flamethrower. I have a satchel charge. This is a machine gun unit. So it does get a little bit more down in the weeds, but it's not a man-to-man style thing. Okay, well, Private Smith has a BAR, and Private Jones has a Thompson submachine gun. And I guess since you don't know what I'm saying, Private Anderson has a Flugeflagon that he's. No, what's that musical instrument? That they always had at the soccer games, at the World Cup.
Vuvuzela.
Yeah, there you go. Private Anderson has a Vuvuzela. I'm just kidding. But yeah, so so you've played, even though this is not considered a war game. Again, some people may argue that, but you've played the game that came out last year, the year before, U-Boat, right?
Yes.
I mean, to me, that's a simulation. That's what it's trying to be. It's trying to simulate, being on a submarine. And I have less and less interest in playing those type of games. I think it sounded cool, and I'm sure if I was really big into naval warfare or sub warfare, from the way you described it, with, you were I guess technically the engineer, but you were working on a clogged toilet for 4 hours. But the fact that the app could pick up the sound, if you were trying to, what they call run silent, run deep, where you don't want to make noise, and the app detected how much noise you were making, and that would kind of influence, to me, that sounds utterly amazing. But I don't know if I want to go through all the other things with the game to be able to, to enjoy that aspect. So, all right. And monster games, I mean, in theory, I would love to play some great monster games. I don't have the time for that. I mean, that'd be one where there's one or two on I want to buy the game because I want to own it, because I love the theme. I love the campaign or the operation that's taking place in it. But I don't know if I'd ever get to play the game itself. But man, I would love setting it up.
So what, and again, this comes back to not knowing what exactly is a monster game. Like, is it a time limit thing? Is it a scope
Yeah.
thing? Is it a, like,
I
what
mean,
is it?
I don't think there's any real true definition to a monster game. I mean, I think for most people, the monster game is going to be one that is going to involve multiple maps. You know, you could have 4 or 5 different paper maps out on the board. That's going to take up a huge amount of, you know, space to the point where it's almost impossible to reach, you know, certain aspects of it. So I think multiple maps, you know, thousands of counters or chits out on the board, and one that's going to take you, if you want to play it in its true monster sense, the entire game, it's going to take you multiple days to probably play. I don't know if a true definition exists. I think it's a term within wargaming that people have just come to use over time. It's almost, you know, it's almost like a myth of, oh, the monster game. Now there are people that play them. There's an organization in Ohio that gets together for like a week at a time, and and they play one game, I think, or maybe they have 2 games going on. And even in Columbus, you know, several years ago, there was a the Columbus area board gamers. There was one table set up in the back that was an ongoing, it wasn't a monster game, it was just an ongoing war game. But, you know, that's, I think when people think monster games, that's what they think about. You know, it's like, you know,
Okay.
five old men sitting around a table for a week, hunched over, and probably, you know, that's you know, they're retired and they have the time to do it.
So for reorganizing these types of war games, you know, there was 4 options listed,
Mm-hmm.
1 through 4. So monster games would be my number 5. That does not sound interesting at all to me. I have no desire to go through it. I'm sure that if you're like any game that's really long, once you kind of get vested interest, you lose track of time because you're so enthralled by it.
Yeah.
Coming from the outside, though, no, monster games, put an X beside that one.
Well, and I think unfortunately for the wargaming hobby is that most people coming from the outside think that's what every war game is, because that's what they see pictures of.
Yeah.
You know, even on the TV show Big Bang Theory, they'll occasionally they'll be playing games, and one of the episodes was Sheldon playing, I forget what it was Battles of North Africa or something about North Africa, and it's one of those huge monster chit games, and he's playing it on the floor. And I think that's, you know, it's kind of the myth of that's what wargaming is. It's kind of like the myth of diplomacy. You know, every game of diplomacy ends up in a fist fight. No, they don't, but that's what people think diplomacy is. So, all right. So operational strategic level will probably be your go-tos. As far as a style of warfare, air warfare, naval warfare, you put down land warfare as being your number one, naval being second, air third, and then space your last choice. And I think that's great because that would be the way that I would rank them as well. So we have that going for us. Player, is there anything about any of those categories that, so I know like air warfare, you have games where you can play individual, you know, fighters or biplanes or whatever. I don't know about too many. I guess if some of you're doing like fighter groups or bombing groups or whatever. Um, Within land warfare, is there anything specific about that you have more interest in than?
I think it's because I'm less interested in the wars closer to where we are
Okay.
in terms of time. So I kind of rank them to say land warfare would be, all wars have land warfare in them, but for a
Do
historical point of view, you know, land warfare would have been the early ones, and then you go to the ship ones, then you go to airplanes, then you go to space. So I kind of rank them to say, well, I'm most interested in the older wars, which would be more of the land into early naval. So
okay.
then the closer it becomes to now into the future, it's like I'm less interested in those. So that's why I put those as 3 and 4.
All right. Player count, you 2 player is what your go-to. And then surprisingly, you have solo as your next choice. And then 3+ players as your last choice.
Yeah.
Have you played? I mean, I know you're not a solo gamer much to begin with. Have you played a solo war game or a war game solo?
No, I have not.
Okay.
The reason why I
Go ahead.
put solo as my number two was because I think of war games as being two sides.
Hmm.
And that's why I put my number one as two players, because I figured each player would take a side. And therefore, the next best thing would be me versus an automated procedure as the other side. For me, when I was thinking of three plus players, one, could I get it played? And two, you'd almost be kind of splitting sides. Like you take this half of the army, I'll take this half of the army. But we're both on almost like team versus team, as opposed to having three or more people. And I know they exist because we talked about someone, I think, offline previously, when you have war games where people are representing different factions fighting for something.
Hmm.
That there are completely different factions, but those, I don't know. I like the idea of two sides, that there's side A and side B, and therefore it's a two-player or solo game.
And I think the vast majority of war games are two player or solo. I mean, it's more of a trend now with three player or multiplayer, with coin games and things like that. But they're definitely in the minority, or they tend to be those longer, monster style games where you need three people on one side, or it will take an hour to move, the chits a couple of hexes. So, all right, let's see here. Let me scroll down a little bit. So time periods, I think we've established, the older the better. You've got, well, you actually got medieval as your number one choice, and then Renaissance, and then Ancients.
Yeah.
So liar.
Well, commands and colors, I prefer ancients. Um, but I figured I'd start with something more medieval to Renaissance, because I was also thinking of ancients is not only Roman, but before then, when things are more disorganized.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why the Roman period for warfare interests me is because they did start coming out with very strong tactics. And then I was thinking, well, that's the start of it. So why not start with something that's a little more modern than that, when they've come up with more different styles of fighting and combat and all that. So I thought that the medieval and Renaissance would give more variety of different styles of combat and things that you could get involved with.
Okay. Yeah, and then so basically what modern modern Vietnam, Korea. Well, actually you got, so it's very disheartening. So modern is your least or lowest ranked,
Yeah.
and then post Napoleonic is your second lowest ranked. That's one of my favorite time periods. What are you doing? That's got to be a top. That's a typo, right? So what is it about that time period, like 1815 to 1910, that is there something about that that you just don't like, or you just maybe you don't know enough about it,
I don't know
or
enough about it.
okay,
It's a time like I know more ancient through kind of agent of region history, and then I know kind of more of the modern histories. That time in between, like say late 1700s to early 1900s, I don't know a lot of the history in there.
okay, all right, and then length of play, you've got 90 minutes uh, as your go-to amount. I mean that, and I put down that on there only because if you're steadfast in that I only want to play a 30-minute game, then that's really going to limit the choices. But as long as you're good with anywhere between hour to 2 hours, you should be okay
Yeah.
with not having, or with having plenty of choices. So
Yeah, I
all
like
right.
my favorite, even in Euro games, I like games that are about an hour and a half to 2 hours. I think that's a good length of time for games where there are strategy in it, because it gives you enough time to develop it, but it also doesn't require 6 hours to play.
Yeah, and I think with war games, everyone thinks, oh, they're all going to be super heavy and super long, and there are light war games out there, and there are companies that specialize in lighter war games. There are companies that specialize in, what I would call smaller war games, and the fact that they don't have a lot of components. They aren't necessarily super heavy, but weight is not their concern. It's less components, less chits, less of a smaller map size and stuff like that. So there's really a ton of companies where you can kind of focus in on what you like, and you'll be able to find something. Style of game, you have blocks as your number one choice, and then chits, and then miniatures. I do love a good block game. I like stickering my blocks. I'm maybe in a minority there, but to me, there's just something. If it's a good game, there's something elegant about that system. So, and I know you own a couple of block games.
Yeah, I was going to mention Hammer of the Scots. That's my first. I'm not sure whether Commands and Colors counts as a block war game, but it was my first game that I've heard other people classify as a block war game, was Hammer of the Scots. And when I heard about it on another podcast, I thought that sounds really interesting. I was able to get a copy of it. I played it and I really enjoyed it. That you were talking about when you were playing in school, the fact that your opponent can't see what piece it is until it's revealed. And then you keep track of their damage by rotating the block. And in the Hammer of the Scots, at the end of each season, I think it's every winter or whatever it is, your people go back to their castles, but you get to decide who goes where. So if I bring a whole bunch of people to attack you and some of them get injured, when I retreat them, or at the end of the time period when they have to retreat to their castles, well, which one went where? Would he put it close to the border? Would he try and kind of hide it in their further castle away? So I really enjoyed that. So that's why I put blocks was my number one.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if Commands and Colors is really a block war game, because there's no hidden information.
No.
I honestly, I've never looked it up to be honest, of whether it's considered one. But you make a good point. I don't know if it would be truly considered a block war game. But all right, and then mechanism wise, and this is kind of, I mean, you can put them in a pecking order, but obviously you're going to have multiple mechanisms through any of the games. I know you like CDGs, those card-driven games, especially where they're a dual-use card and you have to choose, do you want to use it for operation points? I want to use it for an event. I want to use it for whatever. And then, so I'm surprised you have hex movement as your number two, only because I would have thought with the way, especially if you like the operational style and you don't want to get bogged down into, am I moving through marsh, or I move, whatever the case may be. I would think that a point-to-point movement or even an area movement would probably be more to your style, because it's much less topographical and it's more of, okay, I'm moving, I can move two spaces. So I can move from point A to point B to point C, and maybe point A is just another, or point B is just another city, but point C might be a fortress or a stronghold or something like that. But yeah, hex movement is, I'm trying to think how many, there are hex systems that are operational and strategic for sure, because they're dealing with with big theaters, but then those also tend to have more chits and stuff with them too.
I was thinking also hex movement is something that is in Commands and Colors and Memoir 44, in which you have people per hex, and you're just moving them from place to place.
Okay. Well, it's good to see that it's not your last or that your least favorite. So that would really limit what we could do. And then, well, no surprise, dice rolling is your least favorite. Sorry, I don't know. There are games where we don't need dice, but you're just going to have to get better at rolling dice. I don't know what to tell you.
I'll give you a perfect example of dice rolling. And I play a lot of mini games. I used to play a lot of mini games where you're rolling a whole chunk of, 40K, you're buckets of dice. And Age of Sigmar, you're rolling a bunch of dice. There's a game called Malifaux, which is another minis game. And you had a deck of cards. They were special cards in terms of they were, themed to your group that you're fighting with. But you could technically just use a regular 52 deck of cards. And you had a hand of cards in your hand, but when you're doing a combat resolution thing, you'd flip over the top card of the deck to see whether you hit or not. You then got the opportunity to play cards from your hand to overwrite the card that was flipped over. So it's like a random die roll, but you got to do stuff after the fact. So if I was doing it against you, I say I'm going to shoot with my gun. So I flip it over, it's a hit. Then you go, no, it's not. You play a card out of your hand because it was, I forget whether it was either less or more you had to do. I think it was more. Then you got to decide what the outcome was. But then I got the chance to play a card out of my hand to do the same thing. The problem is you didn't redraw your hand. So yes, I can make sure that there's one shot hits by playing all the cards in my hand to make sure you can't do them. But then I can't. There's no response to you if you turn over like a 2. It's like, well, any card can beat a 2, but you got no cards left to play. So I enjoyed. It's not that I dislike the randomness of the dice. I always find that stuff that's only dice and there's no way to modify them after the fact. That's why it's lower on my list.
Yeah, yeah. Being able to mitigate them is definitely a plus for sure. And then you have CRT. So when we talk about CRTs, the combat resolution tables, or combat results tables, depending on the system, those are, I mean, especially if you're playing an older game, they're very popular. They still exist. I mean, they're not nearly as heavily, I guess, included in as many games today. And some of them, I mean, sometimes you just can't get around them. You have to have an odds, a fire factor table. You're counting them up and you're, looking, okay, I have 18 fire factors. My opponent's got whatever defense factors or however it is, and you're rolling dice and you're putting modifiers in there. Sometimes that's just hard to get around and they can be intimidating, but unless you're in a game with, I wouldn't say this, I don't think it's the CRTs that are bothersome, but it can be if they're heavy on the modifiers. And, and again, so what you talked about, okay, well, I've got 18 fire factors. Now let's see. Okay. So I get a +1 because I'm uphill. I get a -1 because my opponent's behind a wall, plus this, minus this, minus. So you're doing this running math to finally figure out, okay, well, basically I've got a +1 and then you're rolling the dice. So they're not in every game, obviously, but sometimes it's just kind of hard to avoid them.
And I'll tell you the reason why it was low on my list is when I was talking before about internalizing the structure of a game or internalizing the game mechanisms. For me, a CRT would be play the game, stop. Let's look on the rule book. Let's stop playing the game and now we'll go look at the rules. If it is like you were saying before, we talk about just the dice rolling. At least the dice rolling is, okay, you're rolling 1 die per person you have out there and 5s and 6s hits. You roll the dice, you're done. Having to stop play to go look up rules in a separate book is why it's low on my list, because I don't want to have to say, okay, let's stop, let's look through all the rules, let's figure out the pluses and minuses, and okay, yeah, it's the sun's now behind you, therefore I get a plus because I can see, I just want to be able to say, I understand how my die rolls work, and that's why I like commands and colors. It's like you had a little chart that said if you're fighting with this type of person, you roll 3 dice. That's it, and you hit based on whether you roll the unit that you're attacking. You didn't have to look anything up. It was all right there, and the play kept going. I've never played with a CRT before, but they get the impression that you play the game, you step out of the game to look at the rule book, and you step back into the game to make your die rolls.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe. I guess it depends on your perspective of how the game's flowing. I mean, most of the, like if you have a CRT and the modifiers, I mean, most of them are generally printed on the game board itself or on the map, or you got the little play sheets. I think, I mean, I guess it can feel like you're stepping away, but most of these games are, you have your movement phase, you have your battle phase. So it's not like in the middle of my movement, I'm stopping to look at charts of, because I need to do an instant battle. And they're, for the most part, they are distinct phases of the game. Now, you may be moving your units and say, do I really want to put this unit in that type of terrain? Let me just kind of do a quick glance of what type of benefits or modifiers am I going to get? Oh, that's a disadvantaged terrain for this type of unit. But to me, that's part of the game, and it's part of you can call it a puzzle if you want, but it's part of the strategy of the game is realizing what you have and how it works best. To me, it's no different than a Euro game where you're engine building and you're getting all your ducks in a row, and then boom, they're going to fire off. Well, to me, in a war game, that's just like getting my line of troops in the right spot on the battlefield with a good commander behind them, and the modifiers are maybe in my favor, but my opponent has no choice. They're gonna have to attack because they've got to get to their objective, and now my engine's going to go off. Yeah, it's still going to be modified by a die roll, but I've done everything that I can to put myself in the most advantageous position. Now, it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you're just on the other end where like, well, I need to get to point B and I got to go through that line. Let's just hope the dice are in my favor. And to me, that's one of the great things about war games, because historically, there are those battles where the person that wins that battle or wins that little part of that battle should have never won it. It was just by the luck, and it was just the right thing at the right time. So, but I understand. I mean, it can. I understand you don't want that interruption. But think about how many Euro games do you play where you don't have to go into the rule book in the middle of the game?
Never.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
And again, I've never used a CRT.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what I think it's going to do. I have no concept. It may be out that it is, you're right. If it's printed on the board and it's a quick little lookup, then it will enhance the game. When you say CRT to me, it is that game breaking coming out to check, several tables in a binder somewhere. But if it's not that, then I may like it. I don't know.
Right. Well, I always look at it this way. Sometimes you just play the game and you realize, oh, that sucked. That did not work at all. And you learn from your mistakes. I mean, you don't have to, sometimes you just want to learn how to play the game based off of the rules and how the game flows. And then later on come back and say, okay, now I know how it flows. Now let me dig a little deeper and figure out how to utilize what I have more efficiently. All right. So location wise, your number one choice is Western Europe. And then Asia. That's interesting. I'm not well versed in a war game set with an Asian theme. So you're talking like Japan, like samurai, or
I was thinking the whole
Mongols.
Yeah, that whole area.
Okay.
Like Asia, South Asia, that whole, like India, China, Japan, the islands, like Vietnam, that whole area.
Okay. And then so Western Europe, Asia, North Africa, I'm assuming because of ancients.
Yeah.
South America. Okay. And then North America, you have number 8. Boy, you were just, I'm never going to get these American Revolution games played. And then, yeah, I broke Africa into North Africa, South Africa. I don't know how many games are actually set in South Africa other than some Zulu games and whatever else is down there. So, okay. I'm really excited about taking all this information, trying to find the right games for you. And I'll kind of allude to it now. So that's the next episode will be me giving some suggestions and some homework for Graeme, and how we're going to do it. I'm not 100% sure. Obviously, optimally, he would be playing face to face. Who knows when that'll happen? So it might be playing online. It might be me begrudgingly dipping my toe back into Vassal. I know Vassal is the go-to, at least one of the go-to sources for online gaming and war games. And I tried it years ago and didn't particularly take to it. I'm hoping that the next time around will be a little different. I may have to rely on Dan, one of my gaming buddies who's huge into Vassal, has multiple games going at any time. But Graham's also a he's a techie, and I'm sure he can crack that high tech code of Vassal. And if all else fails, we'll go even more new age and play by email. um, so yeah, I don't know. I just we'll figure out a way. Maybe we'll set up dueling cameras for a live game. But I think going forward, so like I said, I'm going to suggest some games for Graeme to play. We're going to try to get some played. We're going to do this probably just once a month, and after we've had a chance to get some of these games played, see what Graeme likes, what he doesn't like, kind of tweak it. Maybe heck, 6 months from now, he may just be a full-fledged war gamer and get rid of his entire Euro collection and be he'll come back. His walls will be painted camo, and he'll just be immersed in it all. But if any of the viewers have, based off what you've kind of heard, what his interests are, have any suggestions for games, that would be great. The more suggestions, the better, so we can take a look at them. And we're going to kind of see where this goes. I'm looking forward to it, and I think it'll be fun. I don't know. I mean, that's my hopes, anyways. Hopefully, it's not something that just becomes a chore that he stops avoiding my emails.
Well, I mean, from my point of view, I've kind of dipped my toe into different areas. Like I own Combat Commander Europe, whatever the European
Europe,
version.
yeah.
I own ASL Starter Kit #1. I own Hammer of the Scots and Richard III, which is the sequel to Hammer of the Scots. Both Combat Commander and ASL never got to the table. And Combat Commander, I think we made it through half a game, and I felt like I was missing, like I didn't. Again, it's the whole internalization. I didn't feel like I was playing the game properly, and it was just kind of getting frustrating. Okay, I'm not sure what we're supposed to be doing now. But on the other hand, I've played Warhammer 40K, which has just as thick as rule book as just about any other war game out there. So it'd be interesting to see. Someone's going to slowly push me into the lake face first.
Well, I don't care. I mean, at least Western Europe is your number one. I know you're not big on the tactical, but you're going to play Combat Commander no matter what. So, only because I want to play it some more. And it's also readily available on Vassal.
Right.
Because I think I've played it on Vassal even once. Are there any, I mean, not that you probably have spent a lot of time looking at war games on BGG. Are there any war games that you've heard other people talk about that have piqued your curiosity, where maybe you're like, that sounds interesting? Or do you just block it out when people start talking about war games? You're just like, oh my God.
Unfortunately, I do tend to block out the war game talk, just because it's not something I've ever done before. But I have listened to some other podcasts way back when. And that's how I got interested in the block war games. I would have touched that until I almost need someone to say, this is the game you need to start with. Because honestly, when I hear a lot of people talk about wargaming, or if I go look at the wargaming section of a game store, I guess it's like anybody else who's new to even the hobby board game. You walk into the store and there's shelves upon shelves upon shelves, and you're like, I have no idea where to start. If I pick up this game, am I going to even be able to play it? Am I able to get through the rule book? Am I going to understand how this game plays, or is this going to be a thing of frustration for me? So that's why when the wargaming has come up, I've tended to tune it out, unless you are saying we are doing wargaming for people who have never played a board game before, and here's the ones you should start with. And that's how I got some of my early war games, was that way. So yeah, to answer your question, unless they were talking about that one specific thing about new to wargaming, I tend to tune it out because I assume it's not for me.
So, and maybe we'll do this later on down the road where we'll give some suggestions. Now, obviously, the only thing I could recommend would be if you're trying to get someone new into wargaming, is, to use this type of questionnaire, but ask questions. Figure out what their expectations are, what scares them, or what interests them. Is there a particular time period? Is there a setting? Is there a type of warfare? And then kind of go from there, because for if I was going to do a top 5 list of games to introduce to, to non-war gamers, I mean, that's a great. I'm giving you 5 games, but if they're not remotely interested in ancients, giving me telling them Commands and Colors Ancients would be worthless. So maybe it'd be more um, successful to introduce a system like a Commands and Color system, which which covers a lot of different time periods. I don't know if they're all good implementations of it, but yeah, maybe for a little bit down the road, we'll have you do a top 5 list of games that you would recommend to a non wargamer. Of the when you listen to the podcast or when you had people do those lists before, were there any of the games that you tried that just felt totally flat for you, where you're like, oh, this was not a good recommendation? Because to me, that'd be very hard. That'd be like me going into if I go into a comic book store and ask someone, hey, tell me what comic I should buy. And they give me, you know, Aquaman. And I'm like, well, this is a total, what's going on here?
Nobody likes Aquaman.
Exactly. But it's that guy's favorite.
Yeah. It's been a while since I listened to them. And like I said, the only reason why I picked up Hammer of the Scots is because someone did a full, I even forget what the name of the podcast is now, but they take one game an episode and they usually bring in someone it's their favorite game.
Okay.
So they brought in someone to talk about Hammer of the Scots because he really enjoyed it. And then I listened to that thinking, if you just say try Hammer of the Scots, it's a block war game and its intro, I would have said no. But after listening to someone talk about it for half an hour, 45 minutes, and they're explaining how it really is an easy game to get into, but it offers lots of strategy, it's like, okay, that convinced me to try it. I think we run into, when people give you the top 5 war games, even its introductory games, I view it as the same issue you have as if you are a hobby gamer. I give you the top 5 introductory Euro games. They're probably not going to be the simplest, easy ones to get into because I've been playing Euro games for 10 years. I'm going to give you stuff that's more in the middle, thinking that they're intro because I play heavier games.
Right.
So when I hear a lot of these top 5, introductory things for wargaming, I'm assuming you're coming from the same thing, that you've been playing war games for 5, 10, 50, whatever, however long. And your idea of an intro game is probably a step above what a true intro game is.
Right.
So yeah. I tended to just say, unless you're going to tell me more in depth about the game, I'm going to take your advice with a grain of salt, which I think you should always do that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when when we played Pendragon, I think that was your first coin game, and I the way I remember it, anyways, is I don't think you were overly excited about playing it, just based off of the game length. That was just like, okay, we're gonna do it, and we basically spent an entire day doing it.
Yeah.
By the time we drove to Dan's, we played 6 hours maybe.
I think so, yeah.
And then we drove back or whatever. But it was one of those games where I think after playing it, you're like, wow, I really enjoyed it and I enjoyed the system. And then you played Cuba Libre, and I know you are interested in coin games. So I think, like anything else, as long as you go in with an open mind, I mean, you're not going to like everything. I mean, clearly that's just how things work out. But I was nervous having you play Pendragon because I was thinking, okay, boy, this is gonna be very awkward if he ends up hating this game or whatever. But we both probably 4 hours into it,
at least, yeah.
We're like, wow, like it's been 4 hours already. I mean, time was just flying by. Other than the fact that I was really hungry by the time we got done. It was just it was a great game, great experience. So we'll see if these are half of the enjoyment that you got out of Pendragon. So if not, I guess you can bill me for your time. All right. Anything else you want to add for this first episode?
No, we said we're going to do this monthly. We may get the next episode out a bit quicker because it's just going to be a recommendation, and then leave it between that and the next one a month to give us time. Will give me a time to research the game, hopefully be able to play it with Dean, or if there's a solo mode, play it that way. So get some
Right.
ideas on that.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what another month or two brings as far as crossing that border. For those that don't know, I guess we never really introduced ourselves for any new any new viewers or whatever. But I live in the United States. I actually, well, I technically live in Ohio, although I'm rarely there. I'm usually on the road working. And Graeme is in Toronto area. The GTA, I guess, is the technical term for it. So he's not too far away. He's about he's less than 8 hours from me, but with the border being closed and all that, and it's been more difficult. He hasn't been able to come down for any cons, and we generally get together at least once a year for about a week and do some gaming, and that hasn't happened. So who knows? We are like everyone else, prisoners within our own homes, I suppose. But we will make every effort to get face to face and get some games played, or at least try Vassal. And and I know there are people probably that play Vassal all the time. And like I said, Dan loves it, and he's a big champion for it. I don't know. I'm not a big like video game player, but Vassal to me is, I don't want to offend anyone, but seems a bit archaic. So, all right, I think that'll wrap up this one. Please, since this is on YouTube, Graeme chastises me if I don't say please like or subscribe to the channel, especially if you want to come back. And as we go along, and we may actually do some more in-depth stuff on one particular game. And I don't know if I'd call it a review or anything like that, but you might get some individual episodes on some more games as well. So, as always, please take care of yourselves and your loved ones. See ya.
See ya.